So we've talked about the challenges of estimating investment needs for adaptation and estimating or figuring out the adaptation needs themselves. And obviously there are challenges. This is about addressing the challenges themselves for, to adaptation needs. So addressing challenging adaptation needs. So some adaptation needs are simple, some are supremely challenging economically and otherwise. To keep adaptation investment affordable, it's crucial to monitor asset conditions and ensure efficient selection, execution, and maintenance of investment projects. For example, physical assets that face small climate risks or that are less essential to the rest of the economy may not need strengthening at all. Assets in areas that face overwhelming climate risks can be relocated if possible, possibly rebuilt when cost effective, so cost is always a concern. Strengthening governance to avoid substitution with cheaper design or lower quality material at the construction stage, and to avoid skimping on maintenance is essential to save on future repair and replacement costs. So the idea is to strengthen everything with risk information, and especially compared to the counterfactual world with no climate change and no increasing risks, so that you are always building back better or you're building better for the future. Financing large adaptation costs will change many countries' fiscal space. Obviously, this is not something that is already budgeted or easily manageable with the existing revenues and so on. This is especially the case for lower income countries, which have typically not contributed much to global warming, yet suffer from the largest damages, are burdened with large and competing development needs, and typically have limited fiscal space. Financing adaptation costs will require domestic revenue mobilization, reprioritization of investment plans or other spending, the support of the donor community, or a combination of all these sources. Okay, so look at the table here. Adaptation costs and pre-19 COVID fiscal space. So obviously the report came out just before COVID, and we have gone through COVID now, hopefully done with it, and we have learned many lessons as we discussed in the last chapter. So we'll revisit some of these issues. I have a tremendous wind noise coming through that I cannot do anything about. So hopefully that's not spoiling the recording. Okay. Fiscal space assessments are estimated for advanced and emerging market economies and are based on the debt sustainability assessment from the last published IMF Article 5 report. Risks of debt distress are estimated for low-income countries and are taken from the last published debt sustainability assessment. All these things are buzzwords, technical terms that you can read up on if this is of deeper interest. These assessments were done pre-COVID-19 and do not reflect developments since the outset of the pandemic. Median total strengthening costs are estimated at 0.2% of GDP. Missing countries are absent because of the lack of data. Again, remember, anytime we aggregate to global level, there is a lot of details missing because implementation has to happen at local level. Mitigation, reducing CO2, etc., or greenhouse gases in general, is at a global level, but adaptation is always local. So we are looking here at above median strengthening costs and below median strengthening costs. On the other axis, we have at least some fiscal space or moderate to low risk of debt distress. So in the red again, we have at-risk fiscal space or high risk of debt distress. This is how adaptation is going to play out in this case. So here are the countries ranging from Azerbaijan and Bangladesh, Botswana, China is in here, to Vietnam, and below median strength costs and at least some fiscal space or moderate to low risk of debt distress. Includes countries like Algeria and Australia, very different economic strata: Canada, and you have France, Lithuania, Morocco, New Zealand, US is down here, Singapore is in here. So this is green for good reason, because they are not so stressed and they have some fiscal space, as well as any risk of debt distress will be moderate or low. If you go to at-risk space already in terms of fiscal space or high risk of debt distress, then you have countries like Angola, Costa Rica, Fiji, India is in here, Iran, Malaysia, Pakistan, Uganda. So the Indian subcontinent is here, and surprisingly Bangladesh is in here in terms of having some fiscal space, because Bangladesh is seen as a very highly vulnerable country to monsoon extremes as well as sea level rise and cyclones. In here, below median strengthening cost needed versus at-risk financial space or high risk of debt distress, we have Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Hungary, Italy, Jordan, Lebanon, Nigeria, and so on down to Uruguay, and South Africa is here as well. Okay, continuing with the discussion, international financing flows towards adaptation are hard to track and fall short of commitments and needs. So international financing flows have faced all sorts of issues for the Green Fund, for example, and now it'll play out again for the so-called loss and damage, where the developed world or global community as a whole has to help countries when they face disasters beyond their adaptation capacities, like the large flood in Pakistan or droughts in some other country that you can imagine, and so on and so forth. Okay, so adaptation needs are estimated to be around 0.25 trillion per year by the mid-century, as we saw in the previous figure, or figure 2. Yet studies identify only $22 billion in adaptation financing flows in 2015 to 2016 and $13 billion in 2017 to 2018 on average. Further annual aid for adaptation from official creditors to low-income developing countries was just $10 billion in 2018. Numbers are a bit dated, 5 years old, but still the situation is not much different. This disbursement of international aid for adaptation is hampered by demanding conditionalities and low capacity in targeted countries. We already discussed this in terms of double counting development funds versus adaptation funds, saying you do both with these funds because this includes adaptation and so on, and generally a lack of information with sufficient reliability of future risks at scales needed for small developing states and emerging economies or low-income countries. There is a strong case for additional international support towards vulnerable countries based on needs and equity considerations. Okay, what is additional international support and where is it going to come from? The cost analysis makes clear that adaptation needs tend to be higher in countries with less fiscal space, as we saw, lower institutional capacity, and a larger share of the global poor. Okay, for many of these countries, securing multilateral and bilateral aid is essential, as their needs exceed revenue mobilization potential, and sustainable development goals require greater, not less spending in other areas. So they have to keep managing their crisis in terms of food security, water security, energy security, and keep worrying about managing the crisis of climate already happening in terms of extreme sea level rise, inundation, etc., and plan for the future. So obviously there is a strong case for additional international support for these vulnerable countries without the wherewithal to deal with these multiple crises together. International support for climate adaptation investment can be cost-effective alternative to disaster relief for international donors. So instead of waiting for disasters and then rushing aid in various forms, can the funding instead be made more cost effective by adaptation investment upfront before disasters happen? Increased spending in adaptation investment can lead to a net reduction of total spending for donors that are already providing support for disaster alleviation by reducing climate change risks before they materialize. How to do this? Of course, you have to have good investment strategies, good estimates of risks, and donor countries willing to donate when there is no disaster. Many heartstrings are pulled when there is a disaster, and aid is easier to raise, like Red Cross, for example, does this effectively. But how to get funds to invest in adaptation to avoid disasters before they happen, or reduce the impact of disasters before they happen. This is not easy, and yet that can be more cost effective. Okay, so we'll come back and look at box 2 on unlocking access to climate finance for Pacific Island countries, a specific example, but it tells a story and lessons for generally macro fiscal issues of adaptation to climate change. Okay.